The air conditioner was acting up again. With every passing hour, it grew louder, spitting out bursts of cold air intermittently. I tried to ignore the noise for as long as I could, but by noon, I gave in and grabbed my phone. I still remembered Adam's number by heart, even though I had saved it in my contacts years ago. He was always reliable, came without hesitation, fixed the problem, and left. His work was flawless, but it wasn't even about that. After he was done, there was always this sense of calm. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but so rare these days. Ben was away on a business trip. The apartment was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that usually brings comfort. But today it felt oppressive. "Hi, I've got a problem with the air conditioner again. Can you take a look?" "I'll be there in 40 minutes, came the brief reply. I caught myself staring at my reflection in the phone screen. I ran a hand through my hair and smoothed down my sweater. Silly. When the doorbell rang, I opened the door too quickly. "Hi," I said, stepping aside slightly, a moment too late. "Hi," he replied, stepping inside, habitually taking off his jacket. I noticed that he looked a little different. Tanned, composed, focused, but with something new in his eyes. Or was it just me? Adam didn't waste time. He immediately went to the air conditioner, pulled out his tools. I thought about getting to my own tasks, but for some reason, my gaze kept finding his figure. The confident movements of his hands, the concentrated look on his face. Usually, I didn't think about him while he worked. Today, everything felt different. I tried to focus on my laptop, but after 10 minutes, I closed it. Is it a serious breakdown? Not really. The filters are clogged and the motor's starting to malfunction. It needs cleaning and a part replacement. I nodded, though I barely grasped the meaning of what he said. Silence hung in the air. It wasn't awkward, but there was something strange about it. "We haven't seen each other in a while," he said suddenly, not looking up from his work. I blinked. He rarely initiated conversation. "Yeah, since last summer, I think." Adam nodded. I didn't know what to say next, but something inside me whispered that today, his visit wasn't just another air conditioner repair. "Now I only take on big jobs," he said, tightening the last bolt. I raised an eyebrow in surprise. "I hardly work with private clients anymore, but when I saw your number, I couldn't say no." That sentence sounded so simple, so casual, but I sensed something more beneath it. I nodded, though I couldn't find anything to say in response. We weren't friends, didn't text, never saw each other outside of these brief visits. So why had he decided to come to me if now he had other clients, other priorities? "So you're working on something serious now?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "You could say that," he replied, standing up and wiping his hands. "More work, less time for anything else. And yet you came." He looked at me. There was nothing specific in his gaze, no curiosity, no embarrassment, no hidden meaning. But it lingered for a second longer than necessary. "You know I always come if I can." I nodded again. It was true. He came, fixed things, left. And that was usually the end of it. But why did it feel different today? I walked him to the door, as I always did. But when he reached for the handle, I suddenly realized I didn't want him to leave. The thought flared up sharply, like a match, and just as quickly it faded. But it left behind a strange warmth. "Thanks, Adam." "Anytime." He left, and I stood there in the empty apartment, listening to the silence that suddenly didn't feel so familiar anymore. The next day, I was alone again. Ben called in the morning, talking about negotiations and mentioning he might stay a couple more days. His voice was tired but confident, as usual. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, but my thoughts kept stubbornly returning to last night. To the moment when Adam was standing at the door. To how I hadn't wanted him to leave. I set my phone aside and looked around. There was nothing broken in the apartment, but when my gaze slid over to the bookshelf, I noticed that one of the shelves had slightly tilted. It wasn't critical. I could fix it myself. Or wait for Ben. But the thought of calling Adam came to me before I could stop myself. My fingers dialed his number without hesitation. Hi, we've got a problem with the shelf in the living room. The bracket seems to have loosened. Can you come by? I tried to make my voice sound casual. A few seconds of silence. I'm nearby. I'll stop by in an hour. I hung up and immediately looked at myself in the mirror. A silly thought crossed my mind. Why am I doing this? I could handle it myself. But it seemed like I had already made my decision. Adam arrived exactly on time. When I opened the door, he looked at me just a little longer than necessary, but said nothing. He simply stepped inside, glanced around as if trying to figure out why I had called him. "Where's the shelf?" he asked, taking off his jacket. I led him to the living room and pointed to the slightly tilted edge. He bent down, ran his finger along the edge of the wooden surface, checked the brackets. After a couple of seconds, he straightened up and looked at me. "There's nothing serious here." I knew he was going to say that. "Well, since you're already here?" I shrugged, as if justifying myself. Adam nodded, but there was a subtle shift in his gaze, as if he understood what was going on but wasn't rushing to voice it. I went to the kitchen to make tea, and he got to work, though really there wasn't any work to be done. It took no more than 5 minutes. When I returned with 2 cups of tea, he was already packing up his tools. "I'll handle it myself next time," I said, placing the cup on the table. "Of course," he smirked. "Or you'll just find a new excuse to call me." I tensed up. "What do you mean by that?" He didn't look away. "Nothing. Just noticed." I felt something tighten inside me. He was right, but surely he didn't seriously think that I just wanted to talk, I suddenly said, not even realizing I was saying it out loud. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't look surprised. "All right, let's talk." I bit my lip, unsure where to start. We'd never had long conversations. It was always just about the equipment, the repairs, the payment. But today it was different. "You said you're only working on big orders now," I began, taking a sip of my tea. "So you're pretty busy?" "Enough," he nodded. "Almost no days off. But when I saw your number, I thought I could make an exception." I caught something in his voice. "Why?" He paused for a second, as if weighing whether to answer honestly. "You're one of the few clients where it's always calm. I work quickly. You don't ask stupid questions. There's no fuss." I smirked. "So I'm an easy client?" "You are different." I froze. Those words touched some delicate string inside me. "What do you mean, different?" He lowered his gaze to his cup. "I don't know. It's just easy with you." I didn't know what to say. We sat in silence, listening to the growing evening noise of the city outside. "You didn't call me just for the shelf, did you?" he suddenly asked. I could have lied. I could have said that I just didn't want to risk it, that I was afraid of making things worse. But I didn't lie. "Maybe," I quietly replied. He looked at me but didn't press the issue. A minute later, he stood up, put on his jacket, and glanced toward the window. "Don't you get bored here?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted honestly. Adam nodded as if expecting exactly that answer. "If something else breaks, just call." "Of course," I smiled. When he left, the apartment felt strangely empty. I stared at my tea, which I never finished. The next day, I once again examined the apartment, looking for a reason to call him. And soon I found one. In the evening, Ben came back. I heard the key turn in the lock, the front door creak. At that moment, I was sitting in the kitchen, tapping my fingers on the edge of my cup. "Hi." His voice was as usual, steady, with no hint of fatigue. "Hi, how was the trip?" He took off his jacket, placed his suitcase by the wall. "Successful. We signed the deal, the clients are happy. I am too." I nodded, getting up to heat up his dinner. We ate, exchanging short phrases. I asked him about the new partners, and he answered. He asked me how I'd spent the past few days, and I mentioned something insignificant. A few words about work. The book I had started reading. I didn't mention Adam, though I could have. After dinner, we sat on the couch. The TV was on, but neither of us was watching it. I held my phone in my hands, not opening any apps. Everything okay? Ben suddenly asked. I looked up at him. Yeah. Why do you ask? I don't know, just seemed like you're not yourself. I smirked and waved it off. Just tired. Ben nodded and switched the channel. I pretended to relax, but deep down, I knew I could no longer stop thinking about it. The next day, I walked around the apartment as if looking for something. Something that would give me an excuse to call him again. I checked the kitchen, tested the faucets in the bathroom, looked over the wiring. Then I took the old wall sconce in the living room and slowly ran my hand across it. I could have left it as it was. But instead, I took it down and dropped it on the floor. The glass cracked, but it didn't shatter into pieces. I looked at the shards, held my breath, then took my phone and dialed his number. Hi, the sconce broke, I said, trying to make my voice sound natural. I thought it was just the bulb, but it seems the problem's deeper. A few seconds of silence. I'll come by after lunch, he replied briefly. I hung up. The apartment was too quiet. I stared out the window for a long time before I heard the doorbell ring. When Adam entered, I was already standing by the door, trying not to show how nervous I was. He was on time again, arriving exactly when he said he would. His movements carried the same confidence, the same professionalism as before. He looked at me, nodded, as if he noticed nothing unusual, and headed toward the shelf. Where's the problem? He asked, not lifting his eyes. I pointed to the broken sconce, trying to keep my voice steady, just like usual. But inside, something was stirring uneasily. Adam inspected the sconce, carefully touching the shards. It's a minor break. Nothing hard to fix. Don't worry too much. I nodded, trying not to look as strange as I felt. Like everything around me had turned unreal, and I had lost my sense of reality. He got to work, but too quickly. It seemed like he wanted to finish and leave as soon as possible. We barely spoke, exchanging only short phrases from time to time. When Adam finished, he looked at me again. You didn't call me just for the sconce, did you? His voice was calm, but there was a strange undertone to it. I froze. His gaze wouldn't let go, and there was something in it that I couldn't understand, but it made me feel uncomfortable. Seriously, Catherine, do you know what I think about this? I couldn't say anything. Inside, a thought was tightening, gradually becoming more obvious, but I didn't want to voice it. You don't just want me to fix things in your house. You want me to come. I swallowed. I didn't answer. A sense of unease rose inside me, but it felt like it wasn't mine. He was speaking, but I felt like I was listening from the outside. I'm going now, Adam said, not waiting for an answer. He gathered his tools, checked that everything was working, and headed for the door. I followed him to the exit, and when he was almost at the door, he stopped. You know, if you didn't call me every time, I'd think there was something wrong between us. He didn't turn around, but I could feel his words touch something deep inside. I stood in silence, not knowing what to say. When the door closed behind him, I felt the emptiness fill the room again. It wasn't the kind of silence that allows for rest. It was different, heavy, the kind that makes you want to hide. I was alone again, with fragments of thoughts that couldn't quite come together into anything coherent. Since that day, I tried to avoid thinking about what had happened between Adam and me. I returned to my usual life, but something inside me had changed. Every time he appeared in the house, he left behind an invisible trace I couldn't erase. We never spoke about what had happened between us, but each silence grew heavier. When Ben returned for the weekend, everything seemed to go back to normal. We had dinner and talked about how his meetings and negotiations had gone. I listened to him, but my mind kept replaying a thought that I couldn't shake. I caught myself not hearing his words, not paying attention to his stories. My gaze would drift to the window, the door, the place where Adam once stood, fixing something on the shelf or the sconce. I began to realize that his presence had become an inseparable part of my life. Not as part of the job, not as just a technician, but as something more. But I couldn't admit that to myself. One day, as I was coming home from work, I saw Adam standing next to our building. He was talking to the neighbors, but when he saw me, he immediately headed in my direction. "Hi," he said, his voice warmer than usual. I smiled, a little embarrassed. "Hi, what are you doing here?" "Just helping someone with a repair. And you?" I didn't know what to say. Everything inside me tightened again. What did he mean by that? Why was he suddenly here? I realized I could no longer ask those questions. I tried to pull away, but his gaze caught me again. And in it, I saw something that couldn't be hidden. Something more than just professionalism. "You're not expecting me to leave, are you?" His words were quiet but clear. I couldn't answer because I didn't know what to say. He kept looking at me, and then, seeing that I slightly averted my gaze, he said, "I'll wait until you're ready to talk. But if you don't want to, I'll leave." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't push him away, but I couldn't accept what was happening between us either. "Adam." I whispered his name. He waited a second, then nodded and silently walked away, leaving me standing there with questions I couldn't ask and thoughts that were becoming more and more tangled. At that moment, I felt something inside me break. When Ben came back in the evening, I tried to maintain an appearance of calm, but something inside me wouldn't settle. He looked tired, but there was something different in his eyes, not the usual fatigue that comes from long workdays. I noticed how intently he was watching me, as if sensing that something had changed in my behavior. We sat at dinner, and Ben kept asking questions that I couldn't ignore. He wanted to know how my day went, what was new at work, how I spent my time while he was away. But all of his questions seemed carelessly routine, and I couldn't answer. At some point, while I was just absent-mindedly tearing at the bread, Ben's gaze fixed on me, and he said, "You're hiding something, Kat. I can feel it." My hands froze for a moment. I didn't know what to say. "What are you talking about?" I tried to keep my voice steady. He slightly twisted his lips. "You're not acting like you usually do. I noticed." I looked away. I couldn't meet his eyes. Something inside me tightened, and I felt his words, though not accusing, hit like nails piercing the empty wall between us. "You're not telling me everything. I know something's going on, even though I can't figure out exactly what. Haven't you noticed that you've been avoiding me?" I knew he was right. I couldn't believe what was happening. Every moment I spent next to him felt like emptiness, because my thoughts were elsewhere. They were with Adam. And at that moment, when I didn't want to admit it, I realized that something else was missing, something I could no longer ignore. "I don't understand what you're talking about." It was a lie. I knew he was right. But Ben continued, his voice now firm and direct. "You've been calling him, haven't you?" "Adam. He's been in our house. A few times." "You can't lie to me, Catherine. I noticed that you're waiting for him. And it's not just about repairs." My words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't answer. He was right, and I couldn't hide the truth. "You call him often, and I know it. You won't lie to me anymore." His voice was steady, without threat, but there was such cold certainty in it that I felt sick. The silence in the room became palpable, hanging over us, but Ben couldn't remain quiet any longer. "What do you want from him, Kat?" I couldn't answer. My silence was an answer in itself. Then he took a step back, almost as if struck, as if this truth had hit him to his core. "You think I don't notice? You thought I wouldn't notice?" I felt the air around me grow thick, as though the whole room had contracted. He knew everything. "Do you really think I don't understand?" he continued. I stood there, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to justify myself. It was inevitable. I understood that everything between us had changed now. If I figure everything out on my own, his words pierced me. The consequences will be different. I'm giving you a chance to tell the truth. You can tell me everything yourself. But if you stay silent, I'll act my way. I felt panic rise in me. My silence was worse than any confession, but I still couldn't say what I truly thought, what was in my heart. Ben was silent, his gaze fixed, as if he already knew what I would say but was waiting. I looked at him and felt everything inside me completely fall apart. I had lost trust. I had lost him. And now, when he had figured it all out, I couldn't get it back. The next morning, Ben left early, leaving me alone in the empty apartment. I sat at the table, motionless, staring at the cup of cold coffee that I hadn't finished. Inside me, there was some heavy, immovable weight, and I couldn't understand how to deal with it. He didn't say a word to me before he left, but I felt his presence fade from the apartment, felt his decision fill everything around me. At some point, I noticed the air felt clearer, as if the room had rid itself of tension, but that clean air was unbearably cold. And I knew. It wouldn't come back. The entire day, I tried to collect my thoughts. Ben didn't come back, and Adam still wasn't answering my calls. I tried to convince myself that I could do something, that I could fix everything, that I would talk to Ben and explain. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized words wouldn't help. He had already made his decision. That evening, when I called Adam again, it felt just as empty and cold as the whole day had been. He didn't answer. I left messages, but he simply ignored them. In a way, that was a relief. I couldn't bring myself to make the first move, but he seemed to have taken that role for me. He knew I had been trying to reach him, and he decided it had to end. When Ben returned late that evening, I didn't even hear him come in. He just stood by the door, and I felt his gaze run over me. I couldn't hide my feelings, and it seemed as though there was so much disappointment in that look that I could barely breathe. I didn't know what to say. The words didn't come to my lips. "Ben, please," I whispered, but I couldn't continue. Everything I tried to say sounded as pointless as my calls to Adam. "No, Catherine. You've destroyed our trust. You don't understand what you've done. I don't know if we can go back to what we had. I don't want that." I sat there, motionless, trying not to look him in the eyes. I felt ashamed, and I couldn't find the words to justify myself. But at the same time, I felt the wall between us growing higher, felt him drifting further away. Ben went to his room. I stayed alone. And that was better than talking, better than trying to explain. All I could do was sit in the silence, in which there was no space for return. I understood that everything between us had changed. The night passed, and I remained in the shadow of what I had created. When I woke up the next morning, the apartment was as quiet as always. But it felt different. Ben wasn't talking to me like usual, wasn't asking questions, didn't even pretend that everything was the same as before. He acted calm, but his silence was louder than any words. I sat at the table reflecting on how everything had come to this. It had seemed so simple when I took the first step. A small decision, a small step, just to check what would happen. Just to call him when the shelf wobbled or the sconce fell. Everything seemed harmless. But I hadn't thought that it would lead to something bigger. I hadn't realized I would start losing myself in this game. Ben didn't say a word when he left for work. I couldn't stop myself from calling Adam, but he didn't answer again. I knew he wasn't planning on coming back, wasn't planning to return. And maybe that was right. In the evening, Ben said he had filed for divorce. His tone was calm, almost flat, as if he hadn't done anything unusual. But I felt his words cut through the space between us. I closed my eyes as if I could block it out, as if I could brush it off, as if it were all just temporary. But I knew it wasn't. All these days had led me here. To the moment when there was no turning back. To the moment when everything was lost. "I've filed," Ben repeated when I didn't respond. He looked at me the way you look at someone who no longer exists. I couldn't say anything in return. I couldn't change anything. All the attempts, all the words I might have said, felt empty. I had lost him. I had lost Adam too, because he had gone, leaving me alone at the crossroads where I couldn't decide which way to go. I sat in the silence, feeling that cold distance that with each passing day became more and more apparent. My loneliness was so deep I couldn't understand where its boundaries were. I just sat there, trying to comprehend what I had lost. I had lost everything, and it was the only way to understand what I really wanted. Now I live alone. Every morning begins the same way, with the loneliness I've created for myself. I've gotten used to the silence, though sometimes it makes me feel my emptiness. Time passes, and I keep trying to find answers to questions I can't ask. I get lost in this space that remains after all the decisions, all the steps I once took without thinking about the consequences. Adam moved to another city. Ben and I no longer speak. We simply exist next to each other, each in our own world. He doesn't ask me anything, and I don't dare to disturb him. We both remain silent, but silence is now our loudest word. I can't believe it ended this way. I often think that everything could have been stopped earlier, when I first felt that something was wrong. When his glances became different, when his words turned from just professional to something more than they needed to be. Maybe if I hadn't just called that day, hadn't opened the door, hadn't looked him in the eyes, but it's too late now. Time doesn't turn back. Sometimes it feels like this wasn't just a coincidence, but something inevitable, like it was all predestined. I walked this path, and now here I am, alone, among the consequences of my own decisions. I lost both of them. Maybe this is the only way to understand what I truly wanted. I was always searching for someone who would bring something important into my life, someone who would provide answers to my inner questions. But maybe the answer was here, in the silence, in the solitude. Maybe I needed to learn to be alone. It was hard, but maybe this is the lesson I had to learn. I wake up every day, and this day is like all the others. Empty, but with some new understanding, with the realization that I must move forward, that the life I had before is gone. I am alone, and maybe that's all I need to know. Several months had passed since Ben left, and since the day Adam disappeared from my life. I had gotten used to the loneliness, to the silence that had become familiar. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and don't hear footsteps in the room next door. Sometimes the air feels filled with something unsaid, as if I've missed something. Something unfinished, but I can't remember what it is. I've come back to myself. I started rebuilding my life, but I still found space inside for the questions that wouldn't let me rest. Why did I do this? Why couldn't I stop in time? I began working more than before, diving into projects I had once feared. It was my way of dealing with the pain, doing something that made me move. There were days when I felt like I was finding my place, and others when it seemed like I would never forget. But over time, something changed. I realized that I was no longer looking for excuses. I no longer hoped that someone else would bring me the answers, that someone else would show me the way. I understood that all I needed was to find my own path, without looking back at others. One evening, as I sat on the balcony watching the city, I noticed how easy it had become to breathe. It was strange, as though I had finally freed myself from the weight that had been pulling me down. I didn't try to remember what had come before, didn't replay the mistakes I had made in my mind. I just sat and watched the world around me continue on its course. And maybe that was the moment when I realized I could move forward again. Life doesn't end at the points that seem like the end. Life goes on, and perhaps it will bring something else. Something I will create myself. Maybe this was the path I needed to walk. And maybe in the end, I will be able to forgive myself and start over.